Hi, this is Dr. Phil Rosenkrantz again. This is part 3 of Introduction to Retirement Planning. On the title slide, you'll see that this is a discussion of our savings strategy, and we'll follow that with a look at our investment strategy. So let's go to slide number 2, and you'll notice that with our approach, we've estimated what we think we're going to need at retirement, and now we're going to talk about how much we're going to need to save in order to generate that. But at this point, we need to ask ourselves if some of our retirement expenses will be covered by a pension plan of some kind. So we're going to talk about pension plans a little bit, because if we do have some pension income, we can subtract that from our estimated expenses, and then that lowers the amount that we're going to need to save to supplement that, and then we'll back into our savings goals based on that lower amount. The beauty of this is that we can now, by looking ahead, come up with a savings plan that can make some sense, and we can play with the plan and play with the numbers until we get it to the point that we're happy with it. So let's go to slide number 3 and start talking about pension plans, because they can be a very important part of your retirement plan. Pension plans typically are based on 4 things: your age at retirement, your length of service to the organization, what your final salary level was, and what surviving spouse options that you choose. Let's go to slide number 4. And in general, the older you are when you retire, the higher your pension will be. When I say the word pension, that's your retirement plan. Now, the reason that the older you are, that you get more money, is because your life expectancy is less. So they typically will adjust your retirement to match your age based on this life expectancy. But a rule of thumb, if you don't have anything else to work with, would be something like this: that you'll receive 2% of your final salary level for each year of service. So let's say that you're 55 years old and you've had 30 years of service with the company. Then they would take 30 times 2%, and that's 60%. And so they would take 60% of your final salary, and that would be your pension. That's a rule of thumb. Let's say that you're 65 years old with 20 years of service. Well, 40% of your salary would then be your retirement plan. That's with the rule of thumb approach. Let's go to slide number 5. Some companies, what they use is a points system, and they take your age in years and they add your years of service together, and they tell you that when you hit 85 points, that's the total of the two, then you can retire. Now, on the previous slide, both of those examples hit 85 points. 55 years old with 30 years of service, or 60 years old with 20 years of service. Now, that's a very common kind of retirement plan. Some organizations have a minimum retirement age, but they do have provisions for special early retirements. But a lot of times, if you opt to retire early, they aren't very favorable in terms of what your retirement benefits are. It's a discouragement. But for many people, the early retirement option is what they want. I used to work for General Motors, and General Motors, 55 years is the age that you can retire at with a special early. You can retire, I believe, at age 60 would be a normal retirement, 60 or above. In the California State University system, here right now for faculty, you can retire at age 50 if you have at least a minimum of 5 years of service. Now, keep in mind, if you retire at age 50 with 5 years of service, you're not going to get a very big pension. But let's look at the pension plan. This pension plan for Cal State, and I'm only using this for illustration purposes, it's called a 2% at 55 plan, and again, here on slide 6, you can see that at age 55, the factor that is used, a multiplier that is used to determine your retirement benefits, is 2% times your years of service. So 2% times, say, 23 years of service would be a 46%. And I'm using kind of my own case here. When I'm 55, I'll have 23 years of service, and if I choose to retire, I would get 46% of my final salary as my retirement. And you can see that if I were to work longer and retire later, that at around age 61, I hit 69% of my salary. And what many people will tell you is that when you get to about 2/3 or 3/4 of your annual salary as a retirement benefit, you get to the point where if you were to retire, your monthly cash flow would be about the same as your cash flow was while you were working. And the reason that is because once you retire, you're no longer paying into Social Security, you're no longer paying into Medicare, you're not paying near as much in taxes, you're not paying the expenses of going to work, of having gasoline, insurance, higher insurance, etc. And so your monthly cash flow is very comparable, especially if you paid off your house. So anyway, this is just an attempt to give you a feel for what a couple of different retirement plans might look like, so that when you go to work and you're evaluating and comparing companies, and let's say one has a particular retirement plan and another one maybe doesn't have a retirement plan or has a different one, you've got something to some basis for comparison. Let's go to slide number 7 and now figure out how to adjust our total investment needed. Let's suppose we're going to need $130,000 because we're using a higher tax multiplier because we're going to have a pension. And let's say that you had worked for a company for 20 years and your final salary was estimated to be $100,000. You're going to get $40,000 from your pension plan. So we're going to subtract that $40,000 from the $130,000 you're going to need, which means $90,000 is need to be provided by your pension plan. By your own retirement investments. Let's go to slide number 8. We're going to recalculate our total investment assets needed. And you can see that for the two examples we've been using, the 5% return and 9% return, we now have 1.8 million and 1 million as our retirement assets needed. So let's go on to our savings goals. Slide number 9. If you're working and you're saving and you're investing in the early stages of your life, you can be a little more risky in the kind of investments you make, and you can go for the higher returns. 8% or lower is not too difficult to achieve with some of the investment instruments that are around today. These are long-range numbers. 8 to 12% is possible if you're an astute investor and you do a good job of watching your investments. 12% or higher, that's not very likely. Some people might do it, but it's riskier and just not quite as likely. And again, we're talking about over a long range of time here. If you're going to be an active investor, you might go with the higher numbers. But if you're not a person that is going to be involved with your investments, then don't expect a higher return. Let's go to slide number 10. So how do we estimate our savings needed? Well, we've come up with how much we're going to need in the future, and so we're going to try and back into what kind of a uniform series as a starting point that we're going to need to generate that over our working life. So let's suppose we start with a 9% return on our assets. In other words, that's what we think we're going to get from our investments. And let's say we want to retire in 20 years and we're going to need $1 million. Well, just using the A over F factor for 20 years, then we're going to need $19,500 a year to go toward our retirement. Let's just divide that by 12 to get a monthly figure. We're ignoring monthly compounding by doing that, but for simplicity's sake, that's good enough. That's $1,625 a month. Well, let's go to slide number 11. It's obvious that $1,625 a month is a lot of money, especially if you start that right when you go to work. So we're going to have to play with the numbers a little bit. What if we use the same example, but we use 12% as a return rate? Well, that lowers our savings to $1,158 a month. Well, that's better, but wow, that's a lot of money. Let's see what happens if we say instead of 20 years, we're going to retire in 25 years. Well, that lowers it to $850 a month. But that might still look a little steep. So let's lower it a little more by going to 30 years, and now that's $507 a month. Well, that's not so bad. That's probably around 10% of your starting salary. And, for a typical engineer graduating from school around now. And so that's not too bad. So if you were able to save $507 a month for 30 years, make a 10% return, you could fund that retirement plan. And keep in mind, you can doctor this up a little bit with gradients. You can start out by saving a little less and increasing that as time goes on. In fact, I'm guaranteeing you'd use a gradient of some kind. But at this point, I think you've got the idea that using a spreadsheet and playing around with interest rate and the number of years before you retire, that you can come up with a viable savings plan. Well, that's the end of part 3. And in our next part, we're going to talk about investment strategy. Thank you.